As mentioned, I think we will officially start the session now. My name is Ricarda Mochilnik, and I am going to be moderating this session today. Before we officially start, I want to give you some technical information. So please make sure that your microphone is always muted, because it's a high number of participants here. So otherwise we have a lot of background noise. And if you're not speaking, it might be also good to switch off your camera because of the data transfer, so that the internet connection is good. Also, as mentioned, we are recording this session. So you can re-watch the session afterwards and share it in your networks. We will publish it online on YouTube on the different channels. And we are also right now streaming live on Facebook. I will also post the link of the stream in the chat box. So you can, one moment please. So you can share it in your social media channels. Additionally, please already the notice, when you have questions to the speakers, please post them in the chat box. I will be collecting them and forwarding them to the speakers. Yeah, so officially again, thank you very much for joining this event with the topic Education, the pathway for transformation during and after a crisis. My name is Ricarda Mochilnik. I am working for the International Council for Adult Education, and we are one of the organizing partners of the Education and Academia Stakeholder Group, which is co-organizing this side event of the High-Level Political Forum this year. The Education and Academia Stakeholder Groups consists of 4 organizing organizations and organizing partners. One of them is, as already mentioned, the International Council for Adult Education, as well as the Global Campaign for Education, Education International, and the European Students Union. Our aim is to bring together human rights-based education, civil society organization, as well as academia organizations and networks that work on the right to education. And what we're doing is engaging in the high-level political forum and the monitoring and the review of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this event here today is one of our activities. So in the next about 75 minutes, we might need a little bit longer than 60 minutes. I hope that's okay for you. We will discuss educational pathways for transformation during and after crisis situations, like this one, the COVID-19 pandemic. And we want to discuss what are the trends, gaps, and features of education, and of course of the awareness of human and civil rights in these contexts of crisis. We all know that COVID has left a huge impact on education across the globe, and this very much requires actions and transformative pathways. And we all in the room working for educational organizations know that educational strategies very much can help people to find measures to protect themselves, their families, their teachers, but also teachers and trainers during and also after a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. So questions we will be discussing during the next hour will be, for example, what potential does education and lifelong learning have to overcome a crisis? Actually also maybe even to prevent crisis situations, and also to mitigate consequences of crisis situations. And what kind of educational approaches and what kind of educations do we need to tackle situations like this? I have seen that many of you have already posted their names and organizations and when they are from in the chat box. We want to know a little bit more about you and are very curious to hear. We have a poll for you. you will see a poll in a second popping up on the window. And this is a baseline question we can and will be using also during this session. So the crisis, in your point of view and from your experiences, does it mean more opportunities or challenges for education? 1 means strongly disagree, and 5 means strongly agree. I am having the poll open. About 40% have started already to vote. So this is a baseline question we want to base our discussion on today, and also our speakers today can and will be referring to your impression and how you actually feel in situations of crisis, and how do you see the situation for education in a situation like that. I can see that around 70% have voted, so I'm going to be closing the poll now. I hope that's okay. And you should be able to see our results right now. So from a scale from 1 to strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree, 33% voted for 4 and 3. Well, 4 is a little bit of a middle and an average scale, but 44%, 33% thought that, okay, a crisis like this can actually mean an opportunity for the educational sector. So thanks for participating also in this little poll. It was very interesting to see your experiences and your expression in this regard. And I would like to now introduce you to our speakers before we before I officially hand over to our speakers. The first one will be Pablo Gentili. He's working, or he's the Secretary of Educational Cooperation and Priority Actions of the National Ministry of Education in Argentina. Afterwards, Refaat Sabbah will be speaking he's the global campaign, he's the president for the Global Campaign for Education. Reem Rabbah will be speaking on behalf of the International Council for Adult Education. She's the vice president for the Arab region. And the final speaker will be Robert Napier, who is the president of the European Students' Union. Unfortunately, because of this very short time frame we have, there will be only one Q&A at the very end of this session. I hope this is okay for all of you. But as already mentioned, during the presentations of the speakers, you can very well already post your questions to the speakers in the chat box. I will be collecting them and forwarding them to the speakers. Yes, so that's all from my side. And now I want to already hand over to Pablo Gentili.
Ricarda, it might be that Pablo has some connection problems, although we tested it before the session. But
okay.
He just told me he's resetting his modem, so maybe we can start with.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Although we had technical tests beforehand, sometimes, yeah, we have to be spontaneous. So I hope, Refaat, I hope it's okay for you to start and officially start the panel of today's event. Thanks so much, Refaat.
Thank you. I hope it's okay.
Yes, we can see. Thank you, Refaat.
Okay, I will start immediately from the background. My presentation actually, for that, thank you for this opportunity to be with you. in my presentation, what I did, we gather all the messages from different organizations and we compare it with our messages. So this is a common messages and facts that's going all over the world. It's agreed. All of us, we know that in 2019, it was around 258 million children had never been in the school as a result of discrimination based on gender, disability, poverty, and the impact of conflict and the crisis, including forced displacement and migration. Actually, in this period has been also increased. The COVID-19 pandemic has really increased the numbers of students out of school, with nearly 91% of the world students, more than 157 billion affected by school closure in 194 countries. This number is really scary. The rights of children and the youth are not should be suspended during an emergency, which we have to look at this crisis. We see a lot of excluded for children and youth regarding their right to education. This is some messages that we have to focus on it as educational movements in the world. So the priority and fund education in crisis should be really considered. Policy planning and financial for COVID-19 response must include quality education in all local learning opportunity during school closure should not further exacerbate educational inequalities. Refugees, and internally displaced children and youth should be included with the national and sub-national education COVID-19 response and recovery plans. All the stakeholders have been ensured the gender sensitive in our regarding the education. The government should maintain or increase investment in education, at least 10 to 20 of their national budget, especially in this crisis. They should be even increase the financial for education. Guidance and tools for teachers and education provided should prioritize the use of quality child and youth-friendly emergency remote teaching opportunities. This is very important for the people. COVID-19 education response must also be probably coordinated with various actors. The COVID-19 also response policy programs and funding should support families and caregivers. This message is very important to be understand also regarding the protecting children and youth and ensure holistic approach to the well-being. Safe quality education, including emergency remote teaching. This is also one of the strong messages, ensuring all children, youth, parents, and caregivers have accurate information to support child safeguarding, integrate mental health and psychology support to all efforts to support children and youth during school closure and during their return to schools, including child protection in the development and roll out of learning schools. Schools remain open, measures must be in place to protect youth. Provide additional financial support for teachers, parents, and caregivers. Maintain child nutrition level, where nutrition has previously been delivered through schools by providing alternatives to school feeding programs. Continue to protecting learning spaces. This is also another group of messages is very important for us as a movement to be agreed and to even to change it to the policy action plan for safe return to school. And this is one of the problem that we are now going to face. Government health authority should decide, should be part of the people who decide when the school reopen. Teachers, principals should be engaged in this decision. Not do this decision without involving the teachers and the student and the families. The thinking of the educational system is very important in order to build back better after the pandemic. After pandemic is much riskier than before, because now we have to take some procedure in order to be able to continue in the school, maintain and increase financing support is very important to the school. Teachers, parents, all these targets very important, include teacher in developing COVID-19 education and aid responses. This means that the teachers, the family, the employee, all of the educators, actors should be, or the stakeholders should be part of the decision and preparation to back to the school or even to face the crisis. So to preserve employment and wages for teachers and the school personnel, prioritize the health, safety, and well-being of teachers, learners, families, and caregivers, provide adequate professional support and training. So you cannot leave the teachers like that. You have to take care of them. So there is many teachers has been affected badly, especially in their salary from this crisis. We have to take care about refugee, returning migrant, and displaced children and youth face additional risk, including refugee. You know that the refugee is really in this crisis has been affected badly. And that's why I am afraid that some of the countries, they ignore their needs. So this is where, as a movement, we have to focus to prioritize funding for education for refugee, migrants, and displaced children and youth to avoid catastrophic disaster. Again, a live remote learning program with relevant curricula. This is, you can develop in order to reach this. The girls and young women face additional barriers and risk, and we know how much the teachers have been faced in this crisis. So including girls and young women in decision-making for COVID-19 response, take specific action to ensure that girls and young women have opportunity to access to quality education and learning when schools are closed. Mitigate the risk of sexual exploitation and gender-based violence when school closed. Take measures to ensure girls return to school post-crisis. Like this is one of the important issues that also we have to give our attention, because the women, when we speak about even the student female or teacher female or the families, the mothers has been really carried more role in this crisis, whereas the government policy has been not including them in their policies and in their procedures. Children and youth with disability, this is very important. We need inclusive education responses, and we have to read again the report. The Gentili report has been really published recently to really change or to switch it to a really policy action, involve children and youth with disability and other relevant stakeholders in COVID-19 responses. Government and donors must found and deliver quality distance education for children and youth with disabilities from primary through all levels of education. Implement and fund protective plans and policies. This is all of this in order to really to protect the people with disability, which they face a lot of difficulties in this crisis. Also, as well as the early child period, children has been really ignored totally from the policies in this crisis. So, and also the family should be included as well as the parents in the design of the COVID-19 response in the future, provide accurate information and advice for parents and caregivers on COVID-19, direct resources and design program for all these spaces fund. Also, it's very important to deal with this. This is in general the messages that we should really focus on, and we should switch it to policy or to transfer it to a policy action. Otherwise, these messages will just be written in papers. The situation, if I don't know, Ricardo, if I still have it.
You have still 1 minute. Okay.
I want to end my presentation focusing in the region that I am a Palestinian and I live in Ramallah, but also in this Middle East region, the conflict area, it's really very difficult, very weak. Before even the corona, when the corona came, it make our life is much difficult, especially the people in Gaza Strip who is really have two very strong virus, the occupation virus and the coronavirus. In the Arab region, those in Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Syria, they have the conflict, internal fighting, the internal conflict virus and the coronavirus. So this area, I think at the international level, should be part of our work, should be part of our consideration, and we have to develop the policy at the international level to reduce the negative impact on this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Refaat, for this very inspiring start of today's session. I totally agree with you that a holistic approach is necessary, and it is necessary to have all persons which are affected by the crisis in mind. If it's children and youth, adults, teachers, parents, and caregivers who very much need support in situations like this. You also mentioned refugees and migrants, which are, and also other marginalized groups which face additional risks in these kind of situations. Thank you so much, Refaat. I am now handing over to Reem Rabbah. As mentioned, she's the Vice President for the Arab region for the International Council for Adult Education. Reem, the floor is yours. Reem, you're still unmuted.
Hello, everyone.
Great, it works. Thank you.
Yes. So I'll be talking again about adult education, not formal education, and I'll be talking about the preparedness. What adult education? How can we prepare adult education program to deal with crises and emergencies? I'll present how what will happen to adult education programs during and after emergencies. So to start with, there is a need also, as we prepare our emergency plans to resist or to be resilient to other crises, there is a need also to empower people, adult people, to be able to be resilient, to provide them with the knowledge and skills, to have the policy and plans and procedures, and to have the material needed that will enable them to resist or any disaster, which means to be resilient and to be educated and to know how to continue. As we know, several governments have different ways of responding to disasters, whether the disaster is natural or a health outbreak. Usually, mostly talking about education, they concentrate on formal education. And there is a decision to close schools and other education establishments. And the COVID-19, like other health outbreaks, usually we go back to talking about using online and distance learning to avoid any delay in the provision of education to students. However, for adult education, governments do not give a lot of attention, and it's not considered as a priority. And the continuity of learning hasn't been extended to adults during crisis, talking about COVID-19. However, there are 4 important measures that can be provided if the adult education continues and adult people are provided with their education. It gives them more coping skills, adaptive behavior, and strengthen their ability to be resilient in times of various challenges and insecurity. Here I'm talking about, it might be one of the cases is to provide awareness raising sessions, to provide mental sessions that can help them talk, that can help them know how to be resilient. It can give them some democratic skills and active citizenship, fighting against anti-democratic tendencies and cuts in human rights, because as we know, during times of crisis, usually we tend to neglect these issues. A third issue is to measures for increased employability can take place, and also an example might be like shifting the products or asking some adult learners to support in the production of material or equipment that are needed during crisis, like the production of PPEs or productive equipments during the COVID-19. Also, enrolling in adult education can empower through raising awareness that learning contributes to well-being, and it gives a sense of self that is more resistant. Parents who are educated when students are at home are more able to support their their children, and they feel their mental health is better, and the students or the children feel they have people who can support them at home. So through crisis, there are external factors that can affect education, whether formal or non-formal education. Indirect and direct factors, like for the indirect factors, we have financial resources, the living conditions, the social capital, and for the direct factors or effects, the information and knowledge that we have, the awareness and the cognitive skills that each one of us has. And all of these makes us more resilient to disaster vulnerability, while exposure, talking about exposure and how to the risk of being affected, sensitivity and what the degree of negatively being affected, and the adaptive capacity. The education of children is essential. However, adult education is important because, as we said, it helps to manage the crisis, to mitigate the consequences, and to overcome it based on the knowledge and the skills that the adult has. And this is why public policies must not marginalize adult education. After crisis, as during crisis, governments also will not tend to give priority to adult education during the recovery plans. However, education is a public good. It is a fundamental human right, which means the people who are enrolled in adult education have the same rights, have the same needs to be enrolled, to go to their working places or to their education areas where they can feel mentally at ease, or where they can increase their knowledge and personal capabilities. Positive impacts of adult education, as we said, it improves skills, develop new skills, like when we have people who are learning new skills. Production of PPEs is one of the skills that people may learn during crisis. Increase employability and help reduce poverty. When we had women who were enrolled in the adult education program, in order to help them, we just encourage them to learn how to produce material that are needed during the COVID-19, and they were paid because the COVID-19 went in parallel with an economic crisis. Being paid and being employed had a good impact on the family, and it mitigated the situation. It boosts creativity and innovation because lots of people who are enrolled might have their own ideas in helping, supporting others, or in providing or talking about issues that we can use during crisis. Help green and sustainable recovery. It highlights the human dimension of sustainable development, because always sustainable development cannot be achieved if we're not talking about education, if we're not talking about health, and if a person is not healthy, if a person is not educated, he cannot be healthy, he cannot work. Milding the consequences of the crisis, again, ensures better health and well-being. As I said, adult education, it ensures better health and well-being, because as we know, as we learn more, about the health, about nutritional issues, about the safety issues, about how to protect ourselves, how to protect each other, it will help the society as a whole. It enables more social cohesion. It will benefit in post-crisis, gives some benefit in post-crisis. It provides more support to democratic processes, and it will make people more informed, give more informed judgments about the issues, the concerns they have regarding the environment, regarding their daily life, regarding the work they are doing, or regarding the work of their children. It gives also greater chance to finding a new or improved employment because they are more aware, more empowered. Some examples I can talk about are parents with more information about health and information, transfer the positive norms to their children. People who are healthier are happier and need less costly medical treatments. And this is all applied to our conditions when we're living in a crisis. Being under stress leads to more health problems, leads to more expenditures on health, leads to family instability. Being aware, being knowledgeable on how to resist helps the whole family to continue and to overcome the situation. Adult education makes people voice heard because they know their rights, they know what they have to talk about, they know what they need to ask for and how to ask about it. It helps individuals to live healthy lives, creative and resilient lives. We cannot separate the life of adult learners from the life of formal education, because the same way as formal education has to proceed, adult education has to proceed. Learners who are away from their education centers, if they do not practice what they have learned, they might lose it. If they do not meet with the people they used to gather with, it might affect their mental health. So it's a holistic approach that has to be considered. Again, adult education supports community development. It makes learning truly a lifelong process, not limited to school and young age. Because as we said, it's a continuous education. And this is where we have the cases of women and ladies who are at a certain age, or even men who are at a certain age, come to join the adult education because they want to develop their personal and family lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem, for bringing in the adult education aspect and the lifelong learning approach into this event. Thank you so much for underlining again the benefits of lifelong learning and how lifelong learning helps to live people a healthier life, a more creative and more resilient life. And thank you so much for also bringing forward already the well-being and as well the active citizenship aspect adult education is bringing to communities. Without further ado, I want to hand over to our dear colleague Robert Napier. He's the president of the European Students' Union. And before he starts, I want to ask you all participants again, please write your messages and your questions to the speakers in the chat box. We will have a Q&A afterwards where your questions will be forwarded to the speakers. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Ricarda. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself, and good afternoon from Brussels to everyone. My name is Robert Napier, and I'm currently the president of the European Students' Union. Just before I start very quickly, what is the European Students' Union? The European Students' Union is an umbrella organization at the European level, which represents national unions of students from across the European continent. And our activities are varied. However, we focus our work on 4 main areas of work. That is the quality assurance of higher education, internationalization and mobility, the social dimension, and the public responsibility and governance of the institutions. What I will be doing during this intervention is that I will firstly present an overview of a survey that we have conducted at the European level, because the outcomes of this survey, in discussions that we were having with other regional platforms, are problems that students in higher education have really been facing all across the globe. And therefore, this will be the basis of my discussion, And then I will also give input about the opportunities and challenges that will arise out of the current pandemic and the role of higher education in particular in this regard. I also want to mention that ESO is one of the is very proudly also part of the steering committee of the Global Students Forum, a new initiative that has been set up, which sees the regional collaboration between student organizations on the different regional platforms from all across the world. And we are also very happy to be working with other student organizations from all across the globe. So just very briefly, the summary that we have put, that the survey that we have for students across the European higher education area has about 17,000 responses, and the questionnaire was split up in 7 parts. Unfortunately, the gender and the geographical balance was still not perfect, and the majority of the people who replied were actually respondents aged between the age of 18 to 30. But one very, very important issue that I really want to highlight from the very beginning was that this survey on the impact of COVID-19 on students resulted in 12.9% of those who replied to the survey reporting that they have experienced mental health problems during this pandemic. Now, 13% of this number is a very high amount. And if we take this percentage and analyze whether this is the situation across the globe, this is something that we really need to keep into consideration and keep in mind for when and how institutions and education needs to respond to situations like we have had, like the current pandemic with the COVID-19. Something which is also very, very interesting to highlight was that during this pandemic, we have seen that education has moved online. However, we really need to highlight that what we have been experiencing right now is not digital education, but rather emergency education. Emergency education and digital education are not the same. And to have true digital education, we need to have more pedagogical courses on how to educate students through digital tools. We need to have more investment in resources. We need to make sure that these things are planned. And this has not been the situation that we have had over the past months, nowhere across the globe, because the pandemic hit fast, and institutions and education and institutions in general were simply seeking solutions on how to act quickly and how to respond in this time of emergency. But truly very important to realize that what we have been experiencing has not been the digital education that we should aim to improve over the years, but rather something that we've introduced in order to deal with the pandemic. One particular issue that at least in higher education has really been the case has been that of the workload. The workload, as you can see from the number of respondents, almost half the respondents said that the workload was larger than before the on-site classes were cancelled. And this is something that we really need to keep in mind also for the future. We are now seeing that the reopening strategies in different countries all across the world are starting to be drafted, and different countries will obviously be dealing on the reopening of their educational institutions in different manners. However, we definitely need to plan ahead to make sure that the workload on the student does not become something that is unfair, because ultimately they will still need to have their usual life as usual. Something else which is also very, very important to look into are the skills and infrastructure. And this I will already tie to some of the points that the previous speakers were pointing out. Unfortunately, this education in time of crisis has actually led to way more inequalities and putting those who are already disadvantaged in a more disadvantaged situation. If you look at the table that I am presenting right now, you realize that was, for example, not everyone, but the majority of people had access to a computer and a desk, but for example, only 40% always had a good internet connection to be able to follow the education courses online. Even less had a quiet place to study, and even less had the core study materials which were available online. All of this, and these are the results from a European survey, however, from the discussions that we've already been having, as I said, with our counterparts in the different regions across the world, this seems to be a very, very big problem of what the current pandemic has taught us. And this also leads to what we need to do in the future. We understand that this is a problem, but now we need to come up with the solution. And for the solution, it is very, very important that we truly focus on the inclusiveness and the equity that education needs to offer. If we ever want to truly achieve SDG 4 and have quality education for all, then we need to make sure that everyone, and by everyone we mean everyone, has access to all the resources to be able to follow and have quality education for all, and to have the chances to succeed in an equal manner as the others. Needless to say, this is not the biggest problem in Europe, but also it is a bigger problem across the world, the issue of tuition fees and scholarships. This is something that is always putting a huge strain on the students. The Education and Academia Stakeholder Group, we always say that the access to education should never depend on the size of anyone's wallet or the size of anyone's parents' wallets. And unfortunately, during the pandemic such as this one, this has become even more relevant and even more important. We have seen that in cases where the tuition fees were still remaining the same, there were other circumstances that, for example, were hindering the payment of the tuition fees. We have seen that in certain circumstances, those who were granted scholarships could no longer have these scholarships, and even worse, those who could only pay for their tuition fees by working alongside their studies, because their work was usually halted, could not continue to do so. And all of this were definitely factors that have led to the increase in mental health problems, to the increase in stress on the student life all across the globe. Some important issues to keep in mind when looking at the pandemic and the role of education in overcoming the crisis, and in what kind of education do we need. As I said before, we need inclusive and equitable education at all levels, from early childhood to higher education to lifelong learning. At all stages, now more than ever, we need to make sure that our governing systems, that our education institutions are making sure that everyone has the chance and an equal chance to succeed in their studies. We need to also not kid ourselves and understand that the repercussions of the current pandemic and the repercussions of the current situation will be felt for the years to come. Will be felt both by those students who were already engaged in the education courses, and more so by those who are still about to enter the education courses. And we really need to make sure that both those that are continuing to study, but also those who are still entering into the education, will have an equal chance at succeeding. And to do this, we need to really focus on equity more than equality, because we know that those coming from disadvantaged, underrepresented minority individuals, these individuals will need more of a push now more than ever because of the circumstances that surrounded the current crisis. Another issue that needs to also be kept in mind is the issue of mobility. Mobility in general, not just in education, has been affected very greatly over the past months and during this crisis, and rightly so, because the pandemic and the public health oversaw and became more important than the mobility itself. However, especially in education, we also need to bear in mind it has been playing a crucial role itself, and therefore we need to make sure that later to normal mobility. Unfortunately, at the European level, but also I am aware on other continents, we have been having the situation where countries and institutions have been saying that mobility will be changed with virtual mobility. But virtual mobility is not mobility in itself, and no virtual mobility can replace the experience that you can have from being mobile as an individual. The same thing goes to online classes. Whilst digital learning and online classes are good methods of dealing with a crisis like we have at the moment, however, at least as has been highlighted also through the survey by around 78% of the students, all the students, the 78% of the students preferred to have face-to-face lectures with the students, and the interaction between the teachers and the students is something that should not be undermined and should not be used as an excuse to replace this into the digital world. Also, the importance of having the information and involvement for students. During the current crisis, one thing that we've definitely seen in the role of education is the information that was being passed to the students. And this has been happening at all the levels. Whilst obviously as the European Students' Union, we understand that the institutions and the education ministries, etc. themselves were still trying to figure out how and what to do and how to tackle this emergency. However, the involvement of the students and the information being passed to the students in real time is something which is absolutely crucial if we want to maintain a high level of education. And lastly, we also need, now more than ever, we need education systems to offer more student support services. As I said before, student support services that go beyond simple grants or beyond simple fees that are reduced, etc., but also broadening the student support services to incorporate within them, for example, mental health support, which, as we have seen during this crisis, has become more and more important. Furthermore, we also should look at what kind of education do we need after this crisis. And this is the case for higher education, but is also the case for education at all levels. And in education at all levels, we truly need to start focusing and continue pushing the need of having critical thinking and of pushing critical thinking of students, and do not forget the democratic mission of education. It is only through this that we can be prepared for future endeavors and for future challenges like we have had through the COVID-19 situation and we still are experiencing. And if we do not focus on this, we will not be able to overcome any future challenges like this. Especially higher education as well has a huge role in making sure that the research part is also given a boost, because it is only through research that we can overcome similar situations in the future. Here I just list 3 challenges and 3 opportunities that I see that come out of the current situation. I will start with the challenges. The first big challenge is to ensure the same conditions for study success. We unfortunately, even without the pandemic, this was already a big challenge, because those who come from rural areas, those who come from less underdeveloped areas, they already did not have the same conditions for study success. And the current pandemic has only worsened this and made this an even bigger challenge. The second challenge is balancing of mobility. And the third challenge is the shifting from the emergency learning and teaching into digital learning and teaching. And this in particular will require a lot of resources to make sure that not only do students have the right resources to access learning that is happening online and through digital tools, but also that all the teachers are equipped with the right pedagogical training to be able to offer teaching through digital platforms, which varies very much from that happens in person. When it comes, however, to the opportunities, we really need to see this pandemic as an opportunity to have a sustainable return to normality, and to embed sustainability at all levels of education, from early childhood to higher education to adult learning. The issue of sustainability ties in very much also with Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 4, and truly needs to be embedded, and we should use the current situation as an opportunity to do this. Second of all, tying in with the challenge of ensuring the same condition, we need to make sure that we have inclusive digitalization. And to have inclusive digitalization, we need to make sure that we leave nobody behind. And when we say we leave nobody behind, we truly incorporate everyone and offer equitable resources for people to be able to enjoy their education, their right to education. And lastly, there needs to be a very holistic approach to the student support services, and we need to go beyond the usual things that come to mind immediately at the very same time, and try to move forward and offer a more holistic student support service. I see a message from Ricardo that I should wrap up, and I will be very happy to later on answer any questions from your side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. You have been hitting on quite some issues which were in parallel discussed in the chat room as well, in the chat box. First of all, thanks so much for pointing out and bringing forward the students' perspective in our event here as well. And as mentioned, in parallel, there has been a discussion already on the increased inequalities and how people that are already marginalized have been even more discriminated and disadvantaged during these times of crisis. And you also mentioned the digital challenge. So what happens with the digital gap during these times of crisis? For those that are difficult, for those that is difficult to actually access online means, this situation didn't get better during this last couple of months. So I want to be opening the floor for questions now. As mentioned, there have been some comments or some very elaborate comments in the chat box already, but I want to pick up at the beginning on a very concrete question that was posed to Reem. Reem, Simon has asked you, so there was a statement by you that said governments may not give priority to adult education in their reopening programs. So Kobia is wondering if you have any plausible indications that evidence this, and what do we advise stakeholders to do to arrest the situation? Reem, maybe, yeah, great.
Yes, regarding evidence, yes, I'm talking about the region and what's happening in the countries around. And what we've seen is mostly governments and education sector. They were stressing on students, school students, how to continue their scholastic year and how to help them make their exams, and nothing has been done related to adult education. Maybe at a later stage of the crisis or post-crisis, we started talking about how to get back the adult learners. But during the crisis or during the COVID-19, we were talking mainly about how to get those students in schools. What was the second question?
What do you advise stakeholders to do to arrest the situation?
Yes, I'm reading it. Actually, in countries or governments where they have a formal adult education program, maybe the adult education program would interfere, and they would have plans that would be implemented during crisis and health outbreaks. So as long as we do not have formal education programs adopted by the governments, I think this area will be left behind whenever we have other issues that are considered as priorities. So from my own point of view, it has to be formalized, it has to be put on the agenda of the governments as a priority to be handled.
Thank you, Reem. I hope, and I'm sure you answered Kobia's question very well. Are there any other questions? I see, before I hand over to Katharina, Madeleine brings up the topic on digital learning again. So I'm just going to read out Madeleine's comment, if this is okay. Thanks for bringing up the issue of digital learning. This is a real challenge in Latin America. And she thinks we need to train teachers urgently to make the difference between emergency and digital learning, and also ensure the infrastructure barriers are solved. I think, Katharina, you wanted to come online and come forward on the topic of digital learning as well. Maybe you want to respond to Madeleine?
Yes, so it's a combination of a comment and question to our presenters. So many important issues have been raised, so it's difficult not to go deeper, to try to go deeper to all of them. So I picked up two. There was a lot about the content and kind of learning that we need during the crisis and after. So first of all, I would say my overall impression from all the speakers is that there was a lot about vulnerability, vulnerable groups, and so on. You know, people keep repeating, we are all sitting in the same boat. So we are all hit by crisis. Well, there is a big difference. We are not all hit in the same way and harmed in the same way by COVID. And there are some groups who are really, you know, privileged in dealing with the crisis consequences, and the others who are really suffering. Just if we think of these social distances that was recommended, in many parts of the world, it's a dream. If they would like to, they cannot afford that. Or working from home, use digital skills and work from home. Hey, who can do that? I mean, so many people, millions of people around the globe, they can't do that. they would love to, of course. So I think education after the crisis should tackle these structural systemic inequalities. That's very important. Otherwise, you know, the next crisis will be the same. And the vulnerable groups and the marginalized groups will have face the same problems, and we will have the same talks. Oh, new normal and how to improve the world. So I think that's I would add it to the bunch of the issues that were mentioned that should be a content of the education during and after the crisis. And then to join the question about the digital and emergency and so on. So I think we saw very clearly a tendency, especially in the policy, that we should organize, well, digital learning, and there is emergency and learning related to the vocational skills. So people who are jobless or who became jobless during the crisis, they can find a new job. So how can we show to the governments that some other things like human rights, education about human rights, about democracy, about the participation, even, and it was really nicely mentioned by our presenters, that it should be very inclusive decision-making during the crisis. So people need also to be, to hear and to be educated about their rights, even during the crisis. So how can we showcase to the governments that there is a need for this kind of education during the crisis as well? How can we showcase that it's not only, oh, you know, it's crisis, stop everything, human rights, education, democracy, citizenship, no, we focus on health. I was thinking even as ICA about maybe some initiative on maybe collecting some good practice examples. Some of them were mentioned by Reem and other speakers also. So to prove that to the government and to have some arguments for our policy making and advocacy for education and lifelong learning. So this question might be maybe addressed by some of our speakers if they feel like.
Thank you so much, Katarina. There are some other questions, and I would say, I know we are past our time already, but we will take another 10 to 15 minutes to respond to these questions. So there have been others, but please, if the speakers would want to respond to Katarina, what she just said and asked you.
Can I answer one of her concern? Yes?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I will say something that Katarina mentioned regarding the partnership, the role of the civil society in this crisis and after this crisis. I would say that in this crisis, it shows us as a civil society how much important our internal immunity is very important. What I mean immunity is the internal strength. We as a civil society, we have to look at our internal immunity to be really strengthening ourselves as one voice. We cannot keep working as activity-oriented organization. We have to keep working as a movement. Otherwise, we will get lost, because in this crisis, the voice of the civil society in some of the country has been disappear, while the government, they are leading all the plan regarding the emergency, and they impose all this power in order to manage the crisis alone. They try to marginalize us as a civil society, and that's why we have to rebuild again our thinking, our strategy, our work, our vision, to work as an educational movement and not as organization who do activity here and there. We have to link all of our activity in one vision to strengthen our internal solidarity. We lost some of the internal solidarity in this crisis. We have to bring it again among all the actors of the civil society. We cannot work individually, even as a movement. If you speak about adult education of people with disability or women movement, we have to bring all this movement in one big movement as a civil society. Then we will not let the government to leave us as a marginalized body. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Refaat, for this call to be and to become a very strong movement. in connection to Katharina's call for showcasing to governments that we need to focus also on human rights education, we have a question from, Leonardo, who was asking all speakers, what is your evaluation on our leaders' response to using this pandemic to make profound and systemic changes in our educational system for a more inclusive and quality-focused future? And as this question was posed to all speakers, I might want to start with Robert first. Are you okay to respond to Leonardo?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Ricardo. I hope you can still hear me because there's some background noise coming from outside. Yeah, unfortunately, the leaders' response has really shown also the current pandemic has also shown us the real leaders versus those who are literally looking for an excuse to bring about certain changes and pass them in an undemocratic manner. Especially here, from the European Students' Union's perspective, we did issue a report on the human rights situation across Europe and the differences in which countries have dealt with and the amount of unfortunate human rights infringements that could be seen across the continent. And I am certain and sure also from the readings that this was the case all across the world. But one question that we now truly need to answer ourselves is that at the moment, and this is the question that I had posed with especially when being at high-level events, is that it seems that the government wants to pose the question of whether to prioritize public health or education. And this is always sometimes posed in this manner that, of course, you can expect budget cuts now because we need to make sure that the budget goes mainly to public health. And our response is always the same. Of course, that the public health is a priority. However, education should really be seen as an equal priority. We need to make sure that across the globe and across the spectrum, and education at every level continues to be promoted and we continue to make the shift. And if because of public health emergencies or similar situations like we have now, the education cannot continue or cannot occur in the same manner as it was occurring before, then our role is not to systematically put education at a lower grade than public health, but rather is to try and somehow think together, involve the different stakeholders, and try to find solutions on how to make sure that education is accessible to all in a safe and secure manner. And the civil society organizations will really have a big duty now also more than ever, because the shrink safe space for civil society has been a problem for the past years, not just now. But now it's time to run with problem. With thinking on how to maintain the public health issue. And our role now more than ever is important to make sure to come up with solutions on how to ensure quality education to all and accessibility to.
Sorry, Robert, we are losing you. The connection is a little bit weak and you are muted as well now. Your final sentence, please. Oh, yeah,
yes,
okay.
I had got so.
We couldn't hear you anymore. Okay, thank you so much. Then we have a few more minutes, and I want to combine two questions. Okay. Sorry, there's some background noise. One still refers to the governments, and Beam was asking what should be our strategy to work with governments as their contributor or supporter to support marginalized and needy people in a crisis. And this might be linked to a question from David, who was bringing the financial aspect into focus. So he was saying and writing, as we move from COVID as a health crisis to COVID as an economic crisis, there will almost certainly be massive pressures on public finances in the coming years. And adult education could be a loser as governments invest more in health. So maybe one of the speakers would want to respond to the question, what do you think? What can we do to ensure that public finances recover rapidly, that education is not disadvantaged? Who wants to respond to the finance question?
I speak if there is no one. If there is one, yes?
Reem, yeah, Refaat, please, yes.
I think we are going to face this problem in the future. And this is what happened. That's most of the government, they put social development and healthcare much important than education. And as my friend Grant, he wrote in the chat, we have to look at the education not as a victim, but as a solution for our work. So the government, they should hear from us that the education should be a solution, not a victim. Then they have to put more financial in education. But what I will say something that in this pandemic, they ask the government, they ask the NGOs or the civil society in general to do a relief service. They ask us to clean the schools or to provide the school with the hygiene. This is not our work. Our work is really to focus on policy, as well as we did in the beginning when we noticed that the policy of the government exclude the marginalized people. We have to come again now to put pressure on the government in order to put more finance education. This means that we have, as a civil society, to analyze the budget and to look at the tax and to really to work on the tax justice. We have to rebuild our advocacy now in order to be aware about how we can ask the government to increase the budget, but not just to put also all the load on the local country, in the national countries, but the national also financial organization, they have also a responsibility. International Bank and all the related banks really play role in the economic where they deal with the government again in such far away where they put load on the government in order to and we are afraid that they some of the country who for example who have debt, they will end with really a very strong crisis. And that's why the civil society, they should be stuck to their work as advocator in order to be sure that the education will be priority for all governments. And this things cannot be done from one body. There should be coordination with all the movements, including also some kind with UNESCO, especially with UNESCO, in order to be sure that the education will have really enough funding and not be excluded in the future if the economic crisis hit all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Refaat. I am very conscious of time. Sorry for that. May I ask the panelists or any of the other contributors come forward if they would like to wrap up with 1 or 2 sentences before I'm going to ask Marcella, who will be reading the closing statement of Pablo Gentili, who was unfortunately not able to join again. Robert, please, I see.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. I will just be very, very brief. I really want to highlight that whilst I hope you can hear me because I'm getting a notification that my internet connection is unstable again. But one issue that I really want to highlight is the fact that students and marginalized students really need to be prioritized at this moment. We understand that the situation is difficult for everyone, for all players, for teachers, for institutions, for ministries. but the students are already at a disadvantaged position, and we need to make sure to continue giving them all the necessary information and to empower them to be able to succeed in their studies. And we really need to move beyond offering the accessibility clauses to allow students to enter education. This is very important, but beyond that, we need to make sure that everyone has equal chances at succeeding in education, and that succeeding at their right to education, from the early childhood education to higher education to adult learning. And this really needs to be prioritized.
Thank you so much, Robert. I totally agree with you. Reem, please come forward.
I just want to highlight that we need to see during the coming years the number, how the number of dropout rate and the number of illiteracy will be increasing during the coming 2 years because of health outbreaks and because of political and economic instability in the countries. And this is why, as organizations, we need to highlight more and more the importance of education in limiting this issue, because at the base of health, at the base of economic stability, at the base of all our social development and social stability is education. So I think I agree with Refaat and I agree with Robert regarding equity and equality, providing education to everyone, but there should be I'm talking about here non-governmental organization, I'm talking at the social level, there should be this policy intervention with the government to stress on the importance of providing education, not just basic needs and health support to the people.
Thank you, Reem. And now I want to hand over to Marcela, who will be speaking the closing words of today's event on behalf of Pablo Gentili. Marcela.
Good morning. Thanks for this invitation. I bring the greetings of Mr. Minister of Education of Argentina, Nicolás Trota. The world is experiencing an exceptional, painful, and tragic moment. Nothing will be the same from now on. The pandemic has caused and will cost thousands of human lives. It will also have a dramatic effect on the deepening social inequality that is already growing in all countries, especially in the poorest. The post-pandemic world will be even more unequal than the one we had before, putting the fundamental rights of millions of human beings at risk. We must act urgently, responsibly, in solidarity and creatively. Education in our countries is where inequality has become visible in its most cruel form, not only denying access to school to millions of girls, boys, and young people, but also offering less educational opportunities, schools, and precarious pedagogical conditions to the poorest and most vulnerable peoples. The closure of our educational institutions has affected everyone, but especially the poorest, whose right to education has always been at risk. The pandemic will especially affect them. Our commitment must be today more than ever to leave no one behind. During these weeks, where we have first been surprised and then fascinated by the possibility of holding debates, dialogues, virtual meetings, and webinars, one of the phrases we have heard the most is that the pandemic has taught us many things. This is undoubtedly so. We have learned a lot, although I do not think that is the most mentioned in the meetings where the impacts of COVID-19 on education are discussed. For example, the pandemic is said to have revealed that not all boys and girls held in their homes have the same learning opportunities. An observation whose evidence should have scared us from the very formation of modern educational systems in Latin America, where the poor never had the same opportunities as the highest income sectors and never lived the same way. We did not need the pandemic to recognize the brutal and unfair relationship between the living conditions of the poorest and their opportunities for education or learning. The pandemic has also made us discover the seriousness of the digital gap that separates the richest from the poorest, a fact that we have known for a long time, and it is not limited to the advances in microelectronic-based technological innovations of recent decades. Obviously, there was always a direct relationship between access to basic goods or resources and people's educational opportunities, be it a book or a computer, drinking water, electric, power, or digital connectivity. Pandemic discoveries do not end here. There is no virtual event on the impact of COVID-19 on education, which does not highlight the important role that the family has in the education of children and young people. It is still embarrassing that we discovered this once more than 90% of the world's children were left without schools and had to retreat to their homes to escape illness. Families have always been and will be central to promoting children's education opportunities, although Latin American governments have almost always insisted in ignoring it. Families, their diversity and complexities, have almost never been at the center of priorities for education managers. For instance, little attention has been given to an issue that the pandemic has dramatically exposed. It is mothers who take care of their children's education, which raises the need to think about care policies that are fairer, more balanced, and that do not deepen the already immense gender inequality that exists in our societies. I think we should stop being surprised by what we should have learned by now. In any case, we should be surprised that only in a few fleeting opportunities there have been policies designed to promote effective education equality in Latin America. We are concerned about what the new normal of our school systems will be, although what we should be most concerned about is that we do not return to the normalcy that has always governed our schools, which have been plagued by inequality both inside and outside them. The last issue is fundamental today, more than ever. Educational inequalities will multiply because they occur both inside and outside the school. And if the pandemic has revealed undeniable dimensions of the gaps or abases that separate education opportunities from one another, it has also generated an economic crisis that will have a regressive impact on the right to education of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in Latin America. This is the context that challenges and forces us to act from the government without nostalgia for the old normal and taking advantage of this unexpected and immense crisis to build a more democratic, fair and equal education for our people. Let me conclude with an issue that I consider to be especially relevant. We have already seen that reopening schools is a much more complex task than closing them. While in the North, school systems in many countries have gradually returned to classes, in the South, the debate on protocols and conditions for reopening is beginning to generate controversies. I don't want to stop and tell you what we are doing in Argentina in this regard, but I do want to tell you that we are aware that in addition to being complex, The return to face-to-face classes is a process that should multiply the public investment efforts of our government in the context of an unprecedented physical crisis. Thus, the challenge of guaranteeing in the financing of public education policies cannot be postponed. The fiscal crisis in our states cannot be the alibi that justifies reducing investment in education. Debts, minority privileges, and regressive tax structures cannot be the wall that denies our societies the right to a future with dignity, well-being, and social justice. The Latin American experience shows that in situations of crisis and economic recessions, the cost always ends up being paid by the most vulnerable. Our commitment must be to definitively undo the tragic and persistent indifference of our governments to the suffering, abandonment, violence, and exclusion suffered by significant sectors of our population, especially children. Maintaining our public education budgets will be insufficient. It was before the pandemic. It will be even more so in the post-pandemic. The reopening of schools compels us to a greater commitment from our states with the financing conditions that the health protection of our communities require, the learning needs of our students, and the teaching conditions of our teachers are protected. This is not a temporary emergency situation. It is a situation that will require long-term commitment and changes. This way, the pandemic gives us the opportunity of not being wrong again. This is an opportunity we cannot afford to miss because our future is at stake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcela, for this very moving closing words of this event, coming from governmental representatives, which we very, very much appreciate. And we can only agree that there is definitely a need for strong policy actions and more democratic approaches, specifically regarding vulnerable groups in the education sector. And we have to make sure that our education is seen as with a lot of transformative potential, and our education is not only an adaptive one. And I don't want to be adding anything to these very impressive and very moving closing words. I only want to say thank you to all the participants here today. Thanks for staying longer, way longer than we had actually planned. Thanks to all the amazing panelists. Thanks to Refaat. Thanks to Reem. Thank you to Robert and also Marcela for coming in on a very spontaneous and last minute notice. There were very fruitful and very interesting discussions going on in the chat as well. And finally, I want to encourage you to join the Education and Academia Stakeholder Group. The group is open to all organizations working for the realization of the right to free, inclusive, and quality education for all. And we are working for the implementation of the Agenda 2030, which we have seen today is still needed and will be needed for even longer time after even 2030. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the HLPF, and thanks for joining our interesting discussions and our side event today. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Shona.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo.